A woman arrives for her first day on the job. Her work is set out in front of her: a watch dial, a glass of water, a fine-tip paintbrush, and a tiny vial of glow-in-the-dark paint. Her boss tells her that the best way to paint watch dials is to dip her paintbrush into the water before forming the tip using her mouth. She does this all day. Water, mouth, paint, dial, repeat. But after only a few days at the watch dial factory in Waterbury, Connecticut, her boss came to her and asked, "You don't like this job, do you?" To which she replied, "No, I don't." And she was let go that very same day. Mae Keane had been lucky to land this position, ranked in the top 5% careers for women in the early 1920s. Considered an elite job for poor working girls. The workers meticulously painted the tiny dial numbers on 200 watches per day, and with every digit they painted, they swallowed a bit of paint. Looking back, Mae recalled, "I often wish I had met him after to thank him, because I would have been like the rest of them." For in just a few years, the watch dial painters fell ill by the dozens, impaired by all manner of vicious diseases. Their teeth fell out, their jaws came unhinged, their legs snapped under their own weight, and even their spines crumbled. Out of those top 5% female workers now laid bodies still glowing in their coffins. This is how a company legally took the lives of their own staff and escaped full responsibility. The story of the Radium Girls. Today's episode is sponsored by Honey, the #1 shopping tool in America. Honey is a free online shopping tool that automatically searches for promo codes and coupons so you don't miss out on any savings. I recently bought from my regular bulk coffee place, and I was surprised to see that Honey had promo codes already. It works for things like clothes and video games that you're buying already on shops and sites that you already like. Without Honey, you're basically leaving savings on the table. All I had to do was put what I wanted into my shopping cart and head out to checkout. Then, Honey automatically applied the best promos and coupons it could find. Honey finds discounts of 18% on average after scouring the internet for promo codes. Not only that, Honey has over 100,000 five-star reviews. Not only does it help your wallet burn a few less holes in your pocket, it's just straight up fun to find savings. You can get Honey for free at joinhoney.com/brew. In 1897, Marie Curie made a surprising discovery, one that, on the surface, appeared simple, but had lasting ramifications on the study of radioactivity. After Henri Becquerel discovered that uranium emanated radiation, Curie decided to investigate. Soon after, she found that thorium gave off the same rays as uranium, telling her that radioactivity is not determined by the specific substance, but the amount of that substance. It was this discovery that led Curie to study soils and materials that contained thorium and uranium. She was surprised to see that a uranium mineral called pitchblende was 4 to 5 times more radioactive than the amount of uranium would suggest. This told her that there was something else in there giving off radiation: radium. The dangerous effects of radiation were becoming well known to almost everyone in the scientific community, and even Pierre Curie himself, as of 1903, said that he would not care to trust himself in a room with a kilo of pure radium, as it would doubtless destroy his eyesight and burn all the skin off his body. At the turn of the 20th century, Dr. Sabine von Saussure, who studied radiation under the Curies in France, returned to the United States in 1913 to develop a glowing paint containing radium. The US Radium Company named this new glowing paint Undark. Not long after, Saussure was hired by the United States Radium Company to run their facility in Orange, New Jersey in 1917. Saussure claimed to know all there was to know about radiation. However, by 1917, the man was so saturated with radiation that his mere presence triggered false readings on electroscopes while measuring the purity levels of radium salts. He died at the young age of 45 at the hands of his own creation. Undark was a mix of glue, water, and radium powder that emitted light with no need for power, making it perfect for use in watches, especially in military use. You don't want to get shot by the enemy just because you lit a match to tell the time. Painters would apply a little of the paint to the dials of watches and presto, now you can tell the time even in the pitchest black. Radium became so popular that it was used in all manner of household products. You could buy radium lipstick, radium tonics for health, radium face cream, and even radium chocolate if you lived in Germany. The idea that this beautiful element gave off energy inspired our imaginations so much that people began feeding it to hens, hoping it would help eggs self-incubate and even self-cook. Marketers often use the word radium to inspire their audiences to imagine the possibilities of this new element, even when they contained no radium. From radium silk lingerie to decks of cards veneered with the word radium to even radium brand creamery butter, the word itself seemed radioactive. Back at the factory, Undark Painting began in full force. In the first years of the factory's operation, the Great War was in full swing, so the owners staffed the floor with women, the daughters and wives of men serving in Europe, dubbed the Radium Girls. Each painter was given a single small tube of unmixed Undark per watch dial. Workers would mix the substance before applying it to a dial, and often get some on their hands in the process. The painters would dip their brush in a glass of water before forming the brush into a tip, using their mouth to ensure they could get a fine tip. But after some time, the factory owners removed the water because they believed it wasted too much of the precious radium. Whew. Of course, with or without the water, all of the women working at the factory were consuming radium en masse, every day for years at a time. At peak production, they managed to prepare 55,200 watch dials per year. Up until 1920, the painters were even allowed to eat at their workstation without washing their hands. Eventually, they came to be known as Ghost Girls because of the radioactive glow they emitted after long shifts at the factory. Many of the workers would wear their best dresses to the job so they could glow in the dark at the dance halls after their shifts were over. Some would even apply the paint to their teeth for a radiant smile. The workers, some as young as 15, did ask if there was any harm to consuming the paint, but were told that the paint was safe, moreover, that it was good for them. The factory was saturated with radium dust, and no steps were taken to mitigate the effects. In the early 1920s, not 3 years after the factory opened, workers started falling ill, some even dying. Amelia Maggia, known as Molly to her friends, was one of the first. Her initial symptom was a toothache, which required a tooth extraction to improve. Unfortunately, the teeth next to it also had to be removed shortly after. In the place where the teeth used to be came painful ulcers that would leak blood and pus. The unknown illness spread quickly, reaching Molly's mouth and lower jaw first before traveling into other parts of her body. Her jaw was eventually removed, and despite attempts to save her life, she passed away on September 12, 1922, of a massive hemorrhage. Contrary to what the women in the factory expected, Molly was reported to have died as a result of syphilis. But Molly wasn't the only one. Not long after she met her untimely demise, more and more women started reporting the same symptoms, including the horrifying realization that they could see their own bones glow in the dark through their skin. At the same time, the factory owners vehemently insisted that garden variety STIs were to blame. Remember kids, use protection or else your bones will glow in the dark. Dentists were on the front line combating this new mysterious illness striking the factory workers. They watched in horror as numerous women came into their clinics with dental pain, loose teeth, mouth lesions and ulcers, and tooth extraction wounds that refused to heal. Not only that, many of the workers had their periods suppressed and suffered from fertility issues. If workers were pregnant, they often experienced stillbirths and pressure from doctors who worried about major birth defects, strongly recommending terminations of pregnancy. In addition to that, many of the women developed extreme deformities in their bodies, including bone fractures and shortening of their limbs. One thing medical practitioners noticed was that all the women experiencing these symptoms were either currently or formerly employees of a dial painting factory. The president of the company, one Arthur Roeder, employed the expertise of Cecil Drinker, an expert of industrial hygiene and future dean of Harvard School of Public Health, to evaluate their practices. Drinker, along with his wife and researcher partner Catherine, traveled to Orange, New Jersey to see the factory for themselves in 1924. In his report, he wrote that radium dust saturated the factory. Dust samples were all luminous in the dark room. Workers' hair, faces, hands, arms, necks, the dresses, the underclothes, even the corsets of the dial painters were luminous. One of the girls showed luminous spots on her legs and thighs. Drinker delivered a report to the U.S. Radium Company pleading for increased safety precautions, but Roeder insisted that some outside infection was the cause. He made this claim referencing an internal investigation that denied Drinker's claims. However, Roeder refused to let Drinker see this so-called investigation. Not only that, when Roeder found out that Drinker planned to release his report independently, he threatened to sue. Drinker did reluctantly relent, agreeing not to publish his report. But his colleague, Alice Hamilton, was more tenacious. She had learned that U.S. Radium submitted Drinker's report to the New Jersey Department of Labor, but with major changes. Primarily, this new report absolved U.S. Radium of all culpability in the deaths of the women thus far. Writing to the Drinkers in 1925, Hamilton said, "The New Jersey Department of Labor has a copy of your report, and it shows that every girl is in perfect condition. Do you suppose Roeder could do such a thing as to issue a forged report in your name?" Learning this, Drinker doubled down on his report, ignored threats of lawsuit, and published his findings to the chagrin of Roeder and the U.S. Radium Company. When the report went public, New Jersey's labor commissioner decided that all of Drinker's safety precautions were to be implemented immediately, resulting in the closure of the factory. But that wasn't the end of the Radium Girls' troubles, or those of U.S. Radium's. In 1927, Grace Fryer, one of the former workers at the factory, after 2 years of looking, managed to find a lawyer willing to take on her case. Fryer, in the preceding years, had been attending doctors to get to the bottom of her horrifying symptoms. After getting some x-rays, she found out that her jawbone was filled with tiny holes, and her teeth would surely fall out soon. She consulted the expertise of Dr. Frederick Flynn from Columbia University. With the aid of one of his colleagues, he examined Fryer and determined that she was totally A-okay. She was in perfect health. Okay, that's weird, right? Oh, that explains it. Dr. Frederick Flynn was not a doctor. Flynn was a toxicologist on the payroll of U.S. Radium, and his colleague was one of U.S. Radium's vice presidents. Take that how you will. Fryer was joined by her co-workers Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta McDonald, and Albina Larice in a suit against the company with the help of attorney Raymond Barry and the Consumers League of New Jersey. They sought $250,000 in damages from the company. Today, that would come to about $4 million. However, U.S. Radium had an ace up their sleeve in the fight against the women they poisoned. Just delay the trial until they die horrible deaths, bedridden and destitute, and then happily continue poisoning women for profit. Works like a charm. The company stymied any attempt to set a court date. When the women finally got their day in court in January 1928, none of them were strong enough to even raise their arms over their heads to take their oath. Fryer could not sit up without the aid of a back brace, and she was unable to walk as well. One medical expert testified that the 5 women would be dead within the year, and despite this, US Radium convinced the judge to yet again delay the case because some of their witnesses were on vacation. Because, let's be honest, we wouldn't want to cut someone's vacation short. That would be cruel. Journalist Walter Liepman called this decision one of the most damnable travesties of justice that has ever come to our attention. It is an outrage that the company should attempt to keep these women from suing. There is no possible excuse for such a delay. The women are dying. If ever a case called for prompt adjudication, it is the case of 5 crippled women who are fighting for a few miserable dollars to ease their last days on Earth. Even Marie Curie addressed the case, saying, "I would be only too happy to give any aid that I could, but there is absolutely no means of destroying the substance once it enters the human body." To add insult to injury, the trial uncovered the fact that the male scientists employed by US Radium to process radium into the powder that became Undark were issued lead aprons and only handled the radioactive material with metal tongs, whereas the women who actually handled the paint, who had to put the brushes in their mouths as part of the job description, were given no protective gear whatsoever. In the end, the 5 women's medical bills were piling up, and knowing the case would, in all likelihood, not finish before their deaths, they decided to settle out of court. US Radium agreed to the settlement, but not before they could get District Court Judge William Clark assigned as a mediator for the case. Oh, and by the way, Judge William Clark was also a stockholder in US Radium. That is how the world works. The girls agreed not to hold US Radium responsible for their health issues in exchange for $10,000 each, about $150,000 today, and the promise that US Radium would cover their medical and legal expenses, as well as $600, about $10,000 today, annually for as long as the women lived. What did US Radium have to say about this result? They asserted that they were right the whole time, but settled because the public was biased against them, and they wouldn't have gotten a fair trial. I'm beginning to think fair doesn't mean what I think it means. Continuing, US Radium's new president, Clarence Lee, said, "We unfortunately gave work to a great many people who were physically unfit to procure employment in other lines of industry. Cripples and persons similarly incapacitated were engaged. What was then considered an act of kindness on our part has since been turned against us." Oh, poor them. You may be disappointed to learn that not many of those $600 annual payments actually ended up being paid, since all but Albina Larice passed away before 1939. But this story isn't just about corporate negligence and greed. It's also a story about incremental change. After the trial, the Consumers League of New Jersey, who joined the 5 women in their lawsuit, campaigned to have the radium necrosis classified as an occupational disease. This gave workers the ability to claim compensation when before they were given nothing. Furthermore, in 1941, New Jersey ruled that all industrial diseases were compensatable. The state also increased the amount of time that workers could come forward with claims. The case also led to the creation of the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration, also known as OSHA, 40 years later. This didn't stop the radiation train though, and radium continued to be used for the dials on wristwatches until the 1960s.
The radium-treated dial of your watch, for instance, is harmless.
However, workers were now required to wear protective gear and stricter safety precautions were implemented. Mae Keane, one of the women let go by one of the many radium dial factories littering the American continent, passed away at the age of 107 in 2014. Over her life, she had health problems, bad teeth, occasional migraines, and a couple fights with cancer. It's difficult to prove if any of that was connected to her time in the factory in Waterbury, but her time there definitely wasn't good. It just goes to show how close we are to this history. This is less than one human lifetime away. These women died, often in horrible conditions with no support, but their unwilling sacrifice cleared the way for the labor laws that protect us to this day. We owe them more than we could ever repay, and it's up to us to ensure nothing like this ever happens again. Remember, get honey for free at joinhoney.com/brew.